welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also the founder and CEO of Vertex Partnership Academies, a virtues-based international baccalaureate public charter high school in the Bronx.
And I'm Nique Fazers, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI and an adjunct professor at Rice Business School and WashU Olin Business School.
All right, Nique, great to see you. And as our listeners know, we love to feature some incredible men who is doing work that is quite worthy and certainly worthy of greater exposure and promotion. And we are quite honored to have with us today Musa al-Gharbi, who's written a very, very important new book that we're going to get to. But Musa, welcome to The Invisible Men.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So Musa al-Gharbi, you are a professor of sociology at Columbia University, and you know I've read a bunch of your work, and I've seen you present, and you just have great commentary on issues of race, inequality, social movements, and we're going to talk a lot about that. You've been published in the Wall Street Journal, New York Post, Times, so very well read and very well exposed. And you've now created a new book, which I can't wait to get into. We Have Never Been Woke. The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. So I can't wait to get into, first of all, you defining who's the we in We Have Never Been Woke, and also what is woke? Because it is one of these terms now that's taken on a life of its own, and people have their own definitions. But before we get there, before we get to Musa al-Gharbi, the professor, the writer, the author, would love for you just to share with our audience just who you are, where you grew up, your experiences, and in particular this idea, when did you realize like race was a thing?
Yeah. I mean, so I grew up in a small town close to the U.S.-Mexico border, a military town called Sierra Vista, Arizona. Both of my parents were military, both my mom and my father, and actually my stepdad. I didn't know my father growing up, but he actually has more than a dozen kids. We're close now, now that I'm an adult.
When did you meet?
Well, when I was growing up, I saw him a couple times, just like literally like twice. But then after I have a sister from his first marriage, and when she got married, her big dream, because she knew that she had all these siblings out there from all these different relationships and so on. So she wanted to have all of her siblings come to her wedding, and so she tracked us all down and invited all of us, and we all came, almost all of us, except he has 3 sets of twins, including me. I was a twin, and so one of his oldest sets of twins wasn't there just because he has some feelings, but his brother came, and then my twin brother didn't go because he was killed in Afghanistan back while serving in the army. But all the rest of us went, and we met each other, and we've been, fast friends ever since. We stay in contact and all of this. And now that I live on the East Coast, my father, he lives in Virginia, and so we see each other really regularly now. And I met all this other family that also lives on the East Coast that I didn't know growing up. Okay. So I grew up in a military family, military town. As far as race and how it started to when it kind of impressed itself on me, I guess this was from an early age, in part because my mom is white, my stepdad was also white, and so pretty much as far back as I can remember, they got married when I was 4. People had a lot of questions, especially because right now I look kind of a little pale, but when I'm in Arizona, I get I become a much different shade, especially during those Arizona summers. And so people consistently had questions about kind of
right. One of
what's
these
going
things,
on
one
here?
of these things.
What's the nature of the relationship between these children and these adults? And also, one of the things that I've been meaning to write something about this, but I haven't yet. Well, and then one of the things that was really pressing for my mom also, she was because she married a white dude. She was very keen on helping us maintain organic relationships with Black culture and Black people. And so, even though we were Catholic, we also went to a missionary Baptist church after a Catholic mass.
Every weekend?
Every day. Every weekend. Yeah, we did 2 churches.
Dude,
and
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was. And my mom was like the stereotypical white person in a Black church. Everyone would be swaying this way, she'd be swaying that way, clapping off beat and all of this. But like, God bless her. Like, she was really committed to making sure that we had these kind of robust, organic connections to Black people and Black culture that she wasn't able to provide. And she thought the Black church, that the church was a great way to make these connections. And
how did that make you feel? How did that make you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed it a lot. A lot of my friends, it's interesting. Like, a lot of my friends growing up were typically Black, especially when I was younger. When I was like in elementary school, there was just this sorting that seemed to happen where, we like the black students tended to cluster together. There were a lot of Black families there because it was a military town. And so, yeah, I mean, most of my friends growing up were Black when I was young. And then as I got older, I had my social network diversified a little bit more. I'm not actually sure exactly how or why that ended up shifting a little bit. But one of the things that was striking to me was that because I think is relevant for understanding some of I had a lot of white people my whole life who kind of loved me unconditionally, but they also had some interesting views on race. So, for instance, a story that apparently my grandma, my mom was best friends with a Black lady named Essie, and when my mom, she got pregnant out of wedlock with a Black person. My grandma was from Czechoslovakia, and she was like, and so she was not thrilled about a lot of levels of my mom conceiving a child. And she was like, "Oh, well, how dark do you think they're going to be?" And my mom was like, "Oh, probably like about as dark as Essie." And my grandma allegedly was like, "That Black?" And encouraged my mom to consider an abortion.
Oh my gosh, this sounds similar to the conversation
she didn't,
that allegedly what's the British royal couple had, right?
Yeah, well, and so my mom, of course, didn't do that, and my grandma and we had she, once we were in the world, she loved us. We were there all the time. She loved us. We had a lot of a great relationship and all of this. But so this is the point, I guess, is in virtue of being of having these connections to white people and Black people. One, you're kind of sometimes viewed as like the safe Black, where they can ask questions or say things that they maybe wouldn't feel comfortable kind of going to other. But then two, my kind of views on race were made nuanced by the fact that, and one of the things that troubles me, I'll just say about say Hannah Nicole Jones. So Hannah Nicole Jones is also half white. But she also writes a lot and talks a lot about disparaging white. Like, she makes these really strong claims about white people and white people being racist and America being racist, and maybe there's some truth there, but that's not the whole truth. And she knows it's not the whole truth because she, of course, would have also, like me, been loved and nurtured by white people her entire life, advanced in her career by white people her entire life. Her primary readers in the New York Times are white people. And so this kind of story disparaging the whites, I get it, but it's also, it's also not true. They're like, it's not the whole truth in any case, right? And I think there's this tendency, especially among people who are mixed race, especially to kind of try to achieve distance from the whites by disparaging the whites in a way that's like that I find distasteful.
Musa, just one question about your mom, and it's a belief I have that's not grounded in data, but I want to get your perspective. My simple-minded view is that in mixed race couples where the mom happens to be white, the children are raised to have no limits. They almost have a white perspective on what is possible in the world. And so I look at Barack Obama, I look at you, I look at Derek Jeter. There's just lots of people that have produced exceptional results across many fields. And so often there's a white mother. And I don't have any data to support it, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So the essay I was gonna write that I've been thinking about writing is about how there's. I didn't even realize this until I started writing this book, and really thinking about some of these questions. But like, one of the things that's striking is like a lot of the black kids that I grew up with in my neighborhood, and again, we weren't like poor. We were military family, military community, like straight up middle class, like straight middle class, like not rich, not poor, not close to either one of those things. Okay, but like a lot of especially the black young men that I grew up with, did have significant experience with the criminal justice system. They spent time, a lot of them, for a lot of different things, and often, developing criminal records like kind of puts you in a really tough place with your different. Even my twin brother, for that matter, even my twin brother, he got expelled from high school, and he was actually being investigated for a crime, and then he joined the military. This was like after 9/11, so they just the people who were pressing charges just let it go so he could so he could go serve his country. But this was a thing that and again, like, and we lived in like suburban Arizona, right? So we're not talking about inner city or anything like this. And I didn't, again, it wasn't until I had some distance from this and I was kind of thinking about it that, in fact, one of the striking things is, so for instance, across the street from us, on the house that I grew up in, we had a black family that moved in. And my mom, okay, this is, forgive me, mother, for telling this story. It doesn't reflect well on you. My mom said something like, "Oh, great! I bet there's gonna be like drugs or something in the house." Like, and I called her out immediately. I was like, "That's extremely racist. That's why would you say that? That's crazy." But then the young kids who were there actually did get in trouble for drugs specifically. I was like, come on, come on, like what? Yeah, and so I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to make of it. Yeah. But the reality.
It's actually one of the hardest things when you confront a stereotype, you challenge it, and then it turns out to be true in that specific instance.
Yeah.
And no, I think all of us that are black have faced that experience when, it's like you see the story on the news, someone's been murdered, and you're waiting for the news station to show the perpetrator, and it turns out to be black. And it's just like, you already feel bad for the victim, but now you also feel bad because the perpetrator is perpetuating the stereotype.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, so that's very interesting. I love that question, Nique. So then, okay, so you had this very interesting upbringing. You're now moving into adulthood, and now you're starting to sort of confront different movements around race and identity. So tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll get into We've Never Been Woke. Like, what are these trends that you were starting to see?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'll say, so before when I first started being a fancy nerd, I wasn't really interested in politics per se. I became more interested in politics in a broad way, not like Democrats, Republicans kind of stuff, or domestic culture war stuff. I avoided that like the plague. But then after my brother was killed in Afghanistan, I kind of shifted my focus to looking at national security and foreign policy sort of stuff, with the aim of helping other families avoid going through the kind of tragedy that my own family was working through. But then, in 2013, when you started seeing the kind of Black Lives Matter, the kind of proto Black Lives Matter movement, and this increased period of concern about policing and crime and these kinds of nascent social justice movements that were forming, I started trying to take some of the work that I've been doing on the Middle East, looking at things like social movements, the way that authorities respond to social movements, and this kind of stuff, and seeing, are there any kind of meaningful like connections that can be drawn? Is there any way that I can use some of these analytic frameworks to understand American social movements and politics? And so that was kind of when I started. That was kind of my first steps into trying to into moving into the kind of U.S. context, was exploring some of these questions around policing and racialized inequality in the criminal justice system and so on. And when I started in academia, I think I would probably consider myself, I would have said I had kind of a banal left view of like a typical conventional kind of liberal view of how the world works, and my mom still calls me her liberal son when she introduces me to people, which is funny because that's basically how no one in my current context codes me that way, but whatever. Everything is relative. And yeah, so when I started doing some of this work analyzing inequalities in the United States, or crime and policing in the United States and things like this, initially I had a very, I just kind of subscribed to the same kind of view that a lot of my peers had about a lot of these issues, which is that, policing is inherently bad, any kind of exercise of authority and so on. I mean, maybe not fully that way, but like largely that way. I was kind of in lockstep with my peers about. But then then I started having this problem, and the problem was that when I consulted the kind of best available evidence about Black public opinion in the United States, it seemed that most Black people in the U.S. actually didn't agree with the position that I held, and that a lot of my colleagues held, with respect to kind of what the nature of the problems are, what to do about them, and so on. And that kind of left me in a dilemma of like, okay, well, if the whole point of what I say that we're doing, of what we're doing here, is to help address the concerns of these other folks and address the needs of ordinary people, then we need to take seriously other ordinary people's preferences and priorities and concerns and perspectives. And so that was kind of one of the early moments where I started to see some kind of where I started to experience some kind of doubts in terms of especially popular discourse on race and so on. And we grew up in, well, I don't know about your age, so I won't project onto you, but I grew up in kind of a weird time where, America was presiding over this unipolar world order. There was all this faith that technocracy could solve all these, with the right mix of experts and free markets, we could kind of solve everything. We were in this kind of post-racial moment or something, like we thought we were trending to some post-racial moment. And especially, when Barack Obama was elected, there were a lot of strong narratives, especially in the early days, that this was kind of proof that this post-racial moment that people had been predicting, we were approaching. And then, you could see as I was entering my my graduate studies that you could see this feeling, this optimism that a lot of people of my generation just kind of grew up with and took as normal, was not shared. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the question though.
No. It's these were the forces that were acting on you. So let's get to We've Never Been Woke, because first of all, it's a fascinating read. We definitely encourage our listeners. And before you get in, just talk a little bit about the title. Who's we? when you say we've never been woke, and what is woke?
Yeah. So the title is a play on a different book. So there's a book by a different sociologist, Bruno Latour, called We Have Never Been Modern. And what Latour argues in that book is that the stories that modern people tell themselves about what makes them different from everyone else, these stories actually obscure the nature of the modern world and make it difficult for us to understand the problems of modernity and address the problems of modernity. And so in the same way, I argue that the stories that this group of people I call symbolic capitalists, I'll get into that in a second, the stories that symbolic capitalists tell ourselves about how we're advocates for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, about how we're on the right side of history, and so on and so forth. These stories prevent us from understanding how social problems come about, who benefits from them, and how, and therefore inhibit our ability to actually address those problems, because we're actually some of the main perpetuators of these social problems and some of the main beneficiaries. Okay, so symbolic capitalists, they're kind of the main subject of this book. They've been known by other names, by other people. They've been called the professional managerial class, the creative class, and so on. But basically, they're people who work in fields where you're not providing physical goods or services to people. So if you're doing things like consulting or working in education or tech and science, or finance, or the media, or the arts and entertainment industry, and so on. So people who make a living by manipulating data and symbols and rhetoric and ideas, and so on and so forth. And so that's the we. And the we have never been woke is this constellation of elites that I call symbolic capitalists. Okay, now woke. So one of the things that I don't do in the book is provide a crisp analytic definition of wokeness. And I don't do that in part because I think it's not super necessary. There's this kind of move in the discourse where people want a quick dictionary definition, and if you don't provide it, then they go, aha, you don't even know what you're talking about then. And I think that's kind of a crazy way to understand language in general. So in my class on interpersonal communications, one thing that I like to do is I have my students define apple. I say, provide me the necessary and sufficient conditions of apple that include 100% of apples and exclude any other object or fruit. And we'll sit there for like 10, 15, 20 minutes, and it turns out that it's really hard to define apple. But that doesn't mean if I tell the students, go grab me an apple, that they're going to bring me a steak or a chair. Like the idea that you have to define something in order to understand it, Wittgenstein called that philosopher's nonsense, and I think he's right. But what I do in the book, instead of providing that kind of a crisp analytic definition, is I highlight as I kind of go through the history of this word, some of the I highlight how this constellation of beliefs and dispositions that we call woke. It went by other names in the past, like it went by political correctness in the late 80s to early 90s. And then I walk through some cases, some examples where people on the left or on the right, kind of regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, you would look at this thing and go, oh, okay, that's a thing that people could reasonably call woke. So for instance, trans-inclusive feminism. If you're someone who's not a feminist, you're not woke. No one would look at someone who rejected feminism, said feminism is trash, it's garbage, and go, oh, that person's woke. No one would do that. No one on the left would do that. No one on the right would do that, right? No one in between would do that. And if you subscribe to a view of feminism that's not trans-inclusive, so if you're someone like J.K. Rowling, who no one looks at J.K. Rowling and goes, oh yeah, J.K. Rowling, super woke. People on the left don't do that. People on the right don't do that. People on the right think that J.K. Rowling is a fellow traveler despite identifying as a feminist because she's trans-exclusive in her feminism. And so trans-inclusive feminism is an example of a kind of belief that no matter where you are on the political spectrum, someone who's not a trans-inclusive feminist would not be woke. And someone who was a trans-inclusive feminist would have that's an example of a kind of belief that people would reasonably associate with wokeness. So I go through a bunch of these kinds of things in the book, not to provide a definition or necessary and sufficient, but just to provide texture about what people seem to be talking about when they talk about wokeness.
And one point around texture that I think is important for our audience to understand you better, Musa, and your research is your religious journey. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah. I mean, it's been a weird life. So when so my original plan for life, like I said, I was raised Catholic. My original plan for life was to be a Catholic priest. But then I had this crisis of faith as I was getting ready to really, march into this next phase of life after high school. And for a while, I became an atheist then. There was this basically, okay. Like the problem that I had was I came to be convinced as a result of my study of the scriptures that Jesus probably didn't understand himself to be God or God incarnate. And so that left me in a dilemma because as a Catholic, in the early church, there was a lot of debate about the nature of Jesus and so on, but that had been basically resolved. And as a Catholic, if you reject that notion, it has a lot of really important implications about like the meaning of sacraments like communion or the nature of like the Catholics believe that you have one God in three persons, right? And so on and so forth. So if you kind of reject the Catholic nature of the Catholic understanding of like God, then that's a big problem for you if you want to be a priest. And so I had this kind of problem, and eventually I resolved it by not just saying, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm not Catholic, but by kind of moving aggressively in the other direction and saying, well, I guess I'm just not religious. That I guess like religion in general is nonsense. It's garbage. And I tried to, and so I spent a while as an atheist, and I really tried to live my atheism in terms of my lifestyle and habits, like sex, drugs, rock and roll, all that stuff. But one, that didn't bring me happiness. It just made me feel kind of empty and depressed. And then two, I had this problem eventually where I kind of rationally convinced myself that religion was nonsense and there was no God, but I couldn't really actually make myself feel it. And so I was in a dilemma again, where like I could just try to ignore that feeling that there was a God and that, this world isn't all there is and so on. I could just ignore that, but then that would make me like a bad faith atheist, which is like the lowest of the low in my own mind. Or I could just say I'm like spiritual but not religious or agnostic or something, but that was kind of unsatisfying to me spiritually, intellectually, and otherwise. And so eventually I started looking into other faith traditions. As part of that process, I started reading the Quran. I became convinced that it was a prophetic work, and I was like, well, if I think Muhammad is a prophet and I believe in God, well, that's like two things. That's the Shahada. That's the main. So like maybe I'm a Muslim, and so I looked into Islam more, and eventually took the plunge in 2009. And I think being a scholar as a religious person, probably does influence my research in a few ways. So, for instance, some of the questions that the book explores around social justice, like as a Muslim, we're called upon to not just like think or feel good things and try not to think or feel bad things, but we're called upon to enjoin the good and actively resist things that are evil and immoral things. And so this question of like, do people feel people are saying and feeling nice, warm, fuzzy things, but like, are the desperate and the vulnerable actually being helped? Like, this is an important question to me as a Muslim, and also as a scholar, just as an empirical matter. But like, I think it's not unrelated to my religious beliefs. And then I think I also just have a different orientation towards time than some of my peers. Like if you're taking part in these rituals that transcend geography, that have been done by centuries from people all over the world, when you're taking time out of your daily grind to like try to connect to the transcendent and so on, um, I think, like, so one of the things that the book does, a big contribution of the book, is that it shows that this period of awakening that we're in now is actually a case of something, and that there have been 4 periods like this over the 20th century. But this move to not just try to explain things that are happening today in terms of other things that are also happening today, to kind of take a step back and look in this kind of longer chronological thing. I do this a lot in my work. It's like one of the things that often sets my work apart from other people, as I end up going, oh, this thing that you think is new is actually a case of something. But like, in order to even ask that question, I think part of the reason why I ask that question repeatedly is because I have a different orientation towards time. Like, for instance, pop quiz. Okay. We've been talking about foreign meddling in US elections for like, I don't know, since 2016. So what, like 8 years now?
Yeah.
What's the last major case of foreign meddling in a US political election? Do either of you know? Like comparable to the Russiagate situation.
I cannot.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
An election or just a political process?
No, a U.S. political election. U.S. presidential election. So the case was it was the first time that Clinton ran for office, actually in 1992. So Bob Dole, the Republican opponent, was taking this really hard line on China. And so China tried to intervene in the election to help Bill Clinton win. And it was a big deal. Like the Democratic National Committee had to return millions of dollars in funds. There was a major federal investigation. A lot of people went to jail or fled the country for colluding with China to throw the election. The head of the FBI wanted to appoint a special counsel like Mueller to investigate but they were blocked at every step by the Attorney General, Janet Reno, and to the point where the head of the FBI actually resigned in protest of obstruction by the Clinton administration. And it was a major topic that was talked about. Like Norm Macdonald on Weekend Update talked about the Chinese meddling all the time, all day, every day on that grind. And but this is something that we've been talking about it now for 8 years. Basically, no one even remembers that this other case ever existed. Whenever I tell people about it, it blows their mind. But there's this huge archive of stuff in the Washington Post and the New York Times. You can just, and so I have an article on my website where I kind of walk through this case. But like part of the reason why no one has been talking about it is because a lot of us are part of this mindset that we live in unprecedented times, that all of this is new. And they're trying to explain things that are happening today. Again, looking only at other things that are happening today. And if you have this kind of different orientation towards time, that maybe leads you to think that actually maybe there's nothing new under the sun, as the Old Testament puts it in Ecclesiastes, then you ask a different set of questions, right?
Yeah, I mean the thing is, if you put current context in, like, this has never been happened before, never happened, where it's it's apocalyptic, you're able to create these sort of doomsday scenarios by painting, political figures or whomever as, they're unlike anything we've seen before. And somehow that creates a kind of panic and hysteria that maybe is desirable these days.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people really, across the spectrum, really like the idea, like there's this kind of perverse desire in some ways to think that they're going up against some kind of dictator or fascist. And again, this is even true on the political right. So on the left, of course, this is definitely the narrative. But even on the political right, you see a lot of this. The woke people you compare them to Stalin and Mao and like, not you, but like people compare them to Stalin and Mao and so on and so on. And there's this provocative analyst, Richard Hanania, who drives me batty with a lot of the things he writes. But like, there's this one essay where he had this bit that stuck in my mind, where he said, a lot of these people on the right, I think they fantasize. They wish they were going up against Stalin and Mao. They wish they were, because it helps them obscure the truth. And the truth is, they're getting their circles ran around them. They're getting their butts handed to them. They're getting completely dominated in institutions by young people and women. That's what's actually happening. They're not facing these mighty dictators. They're not these warriors who are going off to fight. You're having these increasingly feminized professions that they're having a hard time fitting in at, and they're getting ran circles around and having a hard time fitting in. And that's what's actually happening. And it's like flattering if you're on the losing side of that to imagine that what's actually happening is you're facing down a totalitarian threat in the likes of Stalin and Mao. But it doesn't really have a good basis in reality, he argued. And that's one of those things where I think he's actually right. God help me. As I think on that point, he's right.
Right. Well, I know, Nique, you want to get to the speed round, but what impact do you think all of this is having on young people in terms of processing as they think about identity? I know in the book you talked about the phenomena where, after the election, school was out for the day because people were so traumatized. And, we're taping this right before the election. It's going to come out and we will know what the results are. But even just today in New York City, one of the most elite schools in New York City, private schools, the Ethical Culture Fieldston School in New York City, has just announced that on the Wednesday after Election Day, school is optional. If you're so emotionally traumatized, you can just, there's just kind of like doomsdayism. And now we have to have our kids, they're so fragile, but it just feels wrong.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that so it's funny, I was at this dinner party with a bunch of other fancy nerds, and this guy who, he was telling me about his kid. This was like, about how his kid cries about politics, about the news, and young, 5-year-old, cries about about politics and asks if things are going to be okay and so on and so forth. And he was like, yeah, do your kids, are they okay? I was like, my kids talk about farts and stuff, bro. If your kids are sitting there, crying, obsessing and crying about politics, it's because you're shoving this down their throats all day, every day. It's that's not the modal kid response, right? The reason why the modal kid response is to fart and laugh about it, or to ride your bikes and get injured and whatever.
Be kid.
Okay. Yeah. And so, I talk about this a little bit in the book. One of the things that was really striking for me, one of the big culture shifts that I had to adjust to, coming from being a shoe salesman in a military town in Arizona to being an Ivy League scholar at Columbia, was that I arrived there just after Trump was elected in 2016. And there was this moment after the election where Columbia students claimed to be so traumatized by the fact that Trump won that they couldn't do their classes, they couldn't do their tests and quizzes, they couldn't do their homework, they just needed time off. And they were obliged by Columbia administration.
Well, that's the thing. They were.
And so, in my class, we were supposed to study social theory. We were supposed to study Du Bois, who's the only Black theorist that we were going to cover all semester. Instead of doing that, we had a rap about our feelings. We talked about our feelings. These are all adults, right? And there was a lady who was white, and she was married to a Korean dude, and she had a half Korean kid, and she was like, "Oh, Trump's going to put my kid in a camp." And I was sitting there like, yeah, he campaigned on rounding up all the half Korean kids. And this is a really well-grounded fear you have here. And there were grown men who were crying, not single tear cry, but ooh, full on sobbing. And there was this other guy who was from France. And him and I were just looking at each other like, what has happened? In fact, he was just sitting there kind of glowering, and then he just got up and left. And I caught up with him afterwards. And he was also like, what the heck is going on here? And the thing that was wildest to me about this indulgence is that, we're here at Columbia. It's an elite school. It's an elite school, not just in the sense that it's ranked high and all of that, but that one of its main social purposes is to cultivate elites. Almost a huge share of the students there are from really advantaged backgrounds. And the people who didn't start there are going to be in really, that's why you go to Columbia. Okay. And so, even in the students' own stories about what was going to happen after the election, that the little guy was going to get crushed and the rich and the powerful were going to be more rich and powerful than ever. Well, guess what? We're at an Ivy League flipping school. Like, we're the rich and the powerful. Like, we're going to be better off than ever. You certainly shouldn't be there claiming to be victims or the little guy or something like that, thinking that you're exceptionally vulnerable or whatever. Like, you're just not even applying your own narrative about the world to yourself. In order to think of yourself and your half Korean kid as as the main victim of Trump and his regime. Meanwhile, there were all these other workers around us. People who mow the lawns and who are the security guards and who serve the food and stuff like that. And they weren't there saying, "Oh, I need time off. I'm so traumatized." And the students weren't like organizing for them. And you didn't see them crying as they scrubbed rich kids' mess out of toilets. Politics. Like, they just showed up to work the next day and did their jobs. And like, this kind of juxtaposition was really sobering for me. But I'll say also, the last thing I'll say on this point, so watching that play out was one of the things that got me started thinking about the book. Okay, but on the psychological point. So I wrote this essay for American Affairs called something like "Understanding the Well-Being Gap, this gap in subjective well-being between liberals and conservatives," something like that. And one of the things that I show in that paper is that a lot of these narratives that we tell people, that they're surrounded by people who harbor secret racial animus that could come out at any minute and really in subtle ways. And when we train people to perceive racism in interactions that they wouldn't have perceived racism in before, or to think that the world is stacked against them, or and so on, these kinds of really pessimistic narratives about race, they often have a really devastating impact on the very people that they're supposed to be helping and empowering.
Absolutely.
And it's like obvious on one hand, if you come to think that the world is stacked against you and that everyone around you is your secret enemy or something, like it's coming to internalize these thoughts is associated with lower subjective well-being, higher levels of anxiety and depression, less social cooperation across difference. Because again, if you can't trust the people around you, and if the people around you also don't think that you trust them because you don't, and so on and so forth, and people are all walking around eggshells around each other because they think that at any moment the other person's going to fly off the handle or say something racist or something like that, then what you often see is actually reduced cooperation across lines of difference, increased depression, increased anxiety, lower flourishing by basically any standard. So we're actually, in the name of social justice, often inculcating people with habits of heart and mind, with modes of social interaction that are actually going to make their lives demonstrably worse. That's a predictable result of the things that we're doing. And we often do them anyways, in the name of social justice, in a way that I find deeply disturbing.
Wow. Learned helplessness may be another way to phrase that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you, Musa. That was some important conversation. So one of the conversation points in our podcast is something we call the speed round, where I'm just going to throw out names of individuals and ask you to pick a side. Which one do you align with and why? And we almost always start with this one, which is Malcolm or Martin?
Okay. I guess I would say Martin, but that said, one of the things that I do talk a lot about in the book is like Malcolm was really good about cooking white liberals in a way that I think, or like really focusing on this point about how like race in America is often this kind of political football between liberals and conservatives, where Black people themselves are kind of an afterthought. And the actual concerns and priorities of Black people, especially working class Black people and so on, are really just an afterthought.
Yep.
And I think he's right about that. But in terms of like approach, I think in order to solve a lot of these problems, it's just impossible to do it, to change much about society. without engagements, without building these kinds of coalitions across different lines. And so, yeah, so I guess I ultimately side with Martin, although, and even Martin Luther King, as I say in my book, towards the end of his life, he actually moved more in Malcolm's direction in terms of how he was perceiving the way that race played out in American political life. But I think his optimism and this kind of trying to build these solidaristic movements across class and race and so on are just really important. So,
Marcus Garvey or Du Bois?
Yeah, that's another tough one. I guess Du Bois, yeah. But that's another that's another toughie for me. Yeah, you know, although I think, yeah, I mean, so Du Bois in the sense that as a scholar, his work influenced me a lot. So this is why I ended up gravitating that way, though. I mean, I know like the political differences between them, I think, are really interesting. But I'll just say, like, one of the things that I think is that Du Bois is underappreciated for is he was really a pioneer in things like people focus on his analysis of race and his focus on race. And, you know, justly so, he actually made like really important contributions in having people understand the race problem, for instance, as being not just like, why is it that the blacks are so, you know, whatever, or like the race problem, as in, why is it that black people are insufficiently grateful towards whites and so uppity sometimes, to being something like, why is it that, you know, to understanding some of these structural conditions and historical conditions and so on. So, you know, people give him credit for race scholarship in a way I think is appropriate, but methods wise, he was also like really genuinely a revolutionary. Like the Philadelphia Negro, if you look at some of the contributions he made to like visualizing data or integrating quantitative analysis with qualitative research, he was like, it was this really important pioneering work that he did. And Du Bois was also just, you know, he gets folded in as this culture warrior, kind of basically now. But as Liam Kofi Bright showed, a philosopher at, he was actually a positivist. He was like very concerned about, and he thought it was actually really important, Du Bois, for people to try to engage in scholarship in a way that was, you know, scholarship has political implications, or sometimes you're studying political questions, but he thought it was actually really important for scholars to be as dispassionate and objective as they could be, in a way that a lot of his successors did not.
And last but not least, and this for most of our audience probably won't be very meaningful, but Noble Drew Ali or Elijah Muhammad?
Yeah, Drew Ali, yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things that's funny, looking at returning to the case of Malcolm, and you know, just thinking about my own life as a Black Muslim and as a convert to Islam and so on. For people who aren't as familiar with Malcolm X, like one of the big journeys that he made in his life was that after he went on the Hajj, you know, before that he had this very this kind of parochial understanding of Islam, a very racialized interpretation of Islam, that understood white people as being basically kind of descendants of demons, kind of, and one of the things he saw when he saw people from all over the world praying together and taking part in these religious traditions and things together, was it led him to a much more universalistic understanding of religion and a much more solidaristic understanding of social movements. And so, you know, he came to when he came back to the States, he kind of repudiated a lot of his original positions and some of the people that I used to work with, and eventually was, you know, I guess there's a lot of dispute about how he was killed and who killed him and why. But one story about how Malcolm X died is that a lot of his former associates basically had it out for him for coming to condemn them and stuff after going on Hajj, and he was basically eliminated by them. But yeah, all to say, as for myself, kind of the late Malcolm approach to understanding Islam and is kind of more my speed than Elijah Muhammad's situation.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah. Musa, just very fascinating your nuance and understanding of these issues, and as I think Nique and I, when we first started this whole endeavor with the Invisible Men, it was partly to confront a lot of the narratives that we think a lot of young Black kids and all kids are hearing about, the structural realities of discrimination in this country. And we created this character, Daryl, 16-year-old Black kid who lives in forgotten USA's imaginary urban city. But Daryl is like so many other Black kids who, doesn't typically hear from folks like the three of us. And we like to ask each of our guests, just what advice would you give to a Daryl about the prospects for his life, what his attitudes will be? What would you say to him?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if you look at a lot of macro data, you do see that there are these kinds of inequalities that track along the lines of race. But general social patterns don't determine your particular life circumstances. And one thing that's really important in life is to control the things that you can control. So there's a lot of, we're all born into social conditions that were not of our design. We all operate within constraints, but we all really do have agency. And there are a lot of different ways that we can choose to live our lives and respond to our circumstances. And so what's really important is to just control what you can control, and to do what you can. A lot of times people do all the right things in the sense that they work hard and they stay focused and things like that, and things don't work out quite like they dreamed. But if you don't control the things that you can control, you can just guarantee yourself that things will definitely not work out as you liked. And then finally, I'll say, there is a lot of research that shows that if you basically do three things, it's called the success sequence. If you basically do three things, if you avoid a criminal record, if you delay having children until you're married, and if you graduate from high school, if you do those three things, basically, if you look at the statistical level, even if you're someone who starts out poor, the chances that you'll stay poor if you follow those three steps are minuscule. They're like 95% chance if you're born poor, you'll exit poverty. You might not be rich, but you'll be middle class, you'll be comfortable, you'll be successful, and so on. And this is an example, right, of controlling the kinds of things that you can control. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, I love it. We actually teach the success sequence in our school in the Bronx. We add in the dimension of work, but you're absolutely right that these are factors, regardless of the larger context, that generally are in your control. That's the whole idea of self-efficacy and agency.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
And there's a lot of research, like your locus of control. This is actually where we sometimes lead people astray, is if we tell them that they're subject to all these forces outside of their control. If we teach people that their locus of control is actually very small, it doesn't actually make their lives better. It makes their lives demonstrably worse. The bigger you feel your locus of control is, the more likely you are to try, and the more likely you are to succeed.
Outstanding. Well, Musa al-Gharbi, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Invisible Men. For anyone who wants to see any other episodes, all of our episodes are located at www.invisible.men. And with that, Musa, thank you for just your nuance and the courage to confront some wrenching issues, which I know it's not always popular and welcome, particularly from a Black scholar.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and actually, I hope it's great to see you again, Ian. Nique, it's been great to meet you. I hope we can stay in touch, actually. But thank you so much for a great interview.
Yep, and
As-salama, Musa. Shukran.